Okay, remember that they are changing my voice. So let's talk about psychology. A key part of psychology, like the foundation of psychology, is the 7 perspectives of psychology, which I call the 7 aspects of psychology. Years ago, I gave the world a formula: 6S plus 3E plus 0.5B plus 0.50 equals R. Okay, the 6S is stage of mind, state of mind. Stage of soul, state of soul. And that includes wisdom and righteousness and justice and so on and so forth. Discipline, what have you. The 3E is for the environment. The 0.5B is for biological factors, and the 0.50 is for other factors. And sometimes the other things can spill over, right? The biological factors can spill over into, where someone has, an extreme degree of biological dysfunction, if you will. Now I'm going to put it in a way that's more simple for you to understand when we talk about the 7 perspectives of psychology. Let me just briefly make it so you're familiar with them, and we'll talk about how the principles of martial arts factor in and how they're key here, and they're also life principles in general. And then I'll tell you why the cognitive perspective is the determinant here. It's just like the S in my formula. It's about, I assign about 60%, okay, of what is the determinant in human behavior in the vast majority of cases. Okay, so if somebody has, extreme retardation, for example, their ability to think and interpret a situation is diminished. So first is the behavioral perspective. This perspective argues that people are more likely to do things because of rewards and punishments. Second is the cognitive perspective. This perspective involves contending that human behavior is influenced by more than simple rewards and punishments, but rather behavior is influenced by how we think and interpret a situation. Irrational and obsessive thoughts are said to influence a person in regards to public speaking, thus influencing their behavior when they're trying to speak publicly. Okay? If you don't understand this, it's fine. Okay? I'll explain it a little bit better at the end. Let me just go through this. 3. The psychodynamic perspective. This perspective involves arguing that the unconscious mind controls our thoughts and actions. Like an iceberg, our behavior is guided by a large part of our mind that we cannot see or control. Our unconscious mind is filled with memories from our childhood that are too dramatic or distressing to think about. Then they are pushed down into the unconscious mind. So they're arguing that it's your unconscious mind, which the government seeks to manipulate, among other things, right? That is the main thing that causes you to behave the way you do, which is not true. We'll get to that, generally speaking. Point number 4, the humanist perspective. The humanist perspective argues, the humanist argues that our behavior is determined by us choosing our paths and making individual choices and striving for personal growth. Now again, we'll get to why the cognitive perspective is greater than that. We'll get to that. Point number 5, the biological perspective. The key idea in this perspective is that biological processes control our thoughts and actions, including hormones, neurotransmitters, and genes. The person in this perspective may focus on specific parts of the brain and what specifically causes physiological changes in the body, like norepinephrine and cortisol. Okay, so they're looking at this stuff in terms of these things with the available sciences. It's a key part, with the available sciences, which are imperfect, obviously. Point number 6, or the 6th perspective, the sociocultural perspective. Now this perspective is number 2 on my list. It's cognitive, then sociocultural. This perspective involves arguing that people's thoughts and actions are influenced by cultural factors, like stereotypes, cultural norms, media, and racial differences. They might argue that people in individualistic cultures have more social pressure to succeed on their own, right? Because they're not collective, like a bunch of people giving up their identity. So they're like, hey, you're on your own, now succeed or you look bad, kind of thing. The 7th perspective, the evolutionary perspective. This perspective argues that people's thoughts and actions are adverse for survival. For example, a person from this perspective might argue that a fear of public speaking exists as the brain is interpreting it as an actual real-life danger or a life or death situation like being chased by a saber-toothed tiger because of how they evolved. Okay. So now all these things factor in. Okay. What you perceive to be rewards and punishments, right? People trying to give you rewards and punishments influence the primitive part of your brain, the limbic system, I believe it is. It factors in, right? Just simple, hey, if you go to work, you get money. If you don't, you don't, so you don't go to work, right? But it's obviously more to it than that. The cognitive perspective is key here, how we think and interpret a situation, the psychodynamic perspective, right? The unconscious mind, how much it factors in. The humanist perspective, right? Our desire to choose our paths and make individual choices and strive for personal growth, it factors in, right? Biological perspective, your biological processes factor in, right? Your neurotransmitters, your genes, the various parts of your brain, right? The frontal lobe and how it operates, they factor in. In fact, I talk about these things over the years in some detail. Though I'm not the expert on brain function, I know enough of it to really apply it to my explanations with a certain degree of efficiency and effectiveness. The sociocultural perspective, which is arguing that people's thoughts and actions are influenced by cultural factors like stereotypes, cultural norms, media, and racial differences, absolutely factors in. And evolution factors in, the seventh one, right? How we've evolved factors in. It helps determine how we behave. However, the main thing that determines our behavior, okay, in the masses of people, okay, is what the cognitive perspective is attempting to describe. Again, this perspective involves contending that human behavior is influenced by more than simple rewards and punishments, but rather behavior is influenced by how we think and interpret a situation. How we think and interpret a situation. Say it with me. How we think and interpret a situation. Irrational and obsessive thoughts are said to influence a person in regard to public speaking. Let me give you an example. My decision to make videos is more than just, hey, I'm going to get a reward if I make videos by going to heaven. But that factors in. But in order for me to get to that idea that that's what's going to reward me, okay, I have to think and interpret a situation. I have to say, hey, I'd rather go to heaven than be a rich worm on this planet. That's how I think. That's how I interpret a situation. Thus, 15,000 plus videos. People's decision not to rally to me has to do with how they think and interpret it. They say, hey, I don't think it's a good idea because I'm going to get in trouble. Okay, that's how they're thinking and interpreting the situation. So it's more than just the idea of rewards and punishments. You have to think and interpret it in the first place. And there's also thoughts that factor in, right? You might get some kind of thoughts from association. Say, well, I've seen someone, rally to someone like that before, and this, and this happened, right? Okay. Now, when we look at the psychodynamic perspective, they say the unconscious mind. Your unconscious mind? No. Okay, there's unconscious processes taking place. Absolutely. But how you think and interpret has to do with how much are you thinking in the first place? You're thinking that you shouldn't think too much, or you're quote-unquote overthinking, and that's what you're interpreting. That is the determinant. You might say, hey, well, no shit. There's a reason why psychologists over the years decided to come together and structure the system this way and present it this way. Because they don't want you to come to the conclusion that your problem is you're not thinking effectively enough and you're not interpreting a situation effectively, and they don't want you to apply that on a sociological scale, on a large scale, in regards to groups of people. They don't want you to think that, hey, society at large is not thinking effectively and they're not interpreting a situation effectively. So they want you to think that, hey, they're just sheep. And what can you do, right? They don't see the reward. Or, the government has operant conditioned them, and therefore they're not going to budge. They don't want you to say, hey, use your fucking head, pal, and you have no excuse. Well, I'm trying. No, you're not trying hard enough. And think about this and that. They don't want you to scramble to correct it. The third point. Okay, well, the unconscious mind, okay, we went over that. So that's not enough, right? For the humanist perspective, right? Are you choosing your paths and making individual choices and striving for personal growth? Yeah, a lot of people think that they are. But before they get there, what do they have to go through? How we think and interpret a situation. That's where they're failing. And that failure has led to their pathetic behavior. Now, what's the Bible saying about it? Say wisdom calls out, Proverbs 8. It's the insight and sense are key in Proverbs. For lack of discipline, people die. In Proverbs, for example, in Proverbs 13:15, good judgment wins favor, but the way of the unfaithful leads to destruction. Now, why are they unfaithful? We go to Proverbs 5, I believe it is, verse 23. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. And are they led astray by their unconscious mind that God allowed them to have in the vast majority of situations? No. They're led astray by their own folly, their own inability to insist on being wise. Their heart is corrupt and it influences their thinking, but how they think and interpret a situation like the pinpointed problem. Okay, their lack of good judgment. Their lack of appreciating righteousness. How they interpret the importance of righteousness is key in their failure. Thus, the cognitive perspective is the closest to correct. But there are also other factors that we can't account for, like spiritual processes, what have you. Okay. Now, the biological perspective. If you were dating a chick and she starts cheating on you and she says, "What was I thinking?" You say, "Well, that's okay, honey, because it's your biological processes that cause that." If you catch somebody saying that to some chick, you should seriously consider slapping them across the fucking face. The fuck you talking about? Tell that chick to use her fucking head. Okay. The sixth one, the sociocultural perspective. Are thoughts and actions influenced by cultural factors like stereotypes, cultural norms, media, and racial differences? Yes. But what comes first? As you come into this world and you see Snow White and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, okay, and Aladdin, when you're my age and you grow up, right? You see gangster movies, romantic comedies, you see Star Wars, sci-fi, as you see these things, as people talk to you about the Bible, right? There's a certain mix of things that you're getting. And as you're thinking and interpreting the situation, you're saying, well, I'm going to do it this way instead of doing the right thing, okay? Now, when you're me growing up, as I looked at it, I said, I'm not going to be a square. They're evil. They're like it's like the people who are trying to be polite who work for, the Empire and Darth Vader. And they're like, hey, come learn my craft and come work on the Death Star. Fuck you. Okay? I'd rather be like Han Solo or something. Get him the fuck out of my face. You see what I'm saying? So that's why I started hanging out with thugs and so on and so forth. I said, where's the exact place I can kind of pull on society from? Because the churches aren't it. The mainstream culture isn't it. The police, the military, they're not it. The politicians, political, they're not it either. My parents are overprotective. What they're suggesting is not pinpointed. So I rebelled against all the evils, and I said, who's the closest to my view? There you go. So was it simply the cultural factors like stereotypes, cultural norms, media, and racial differences that caused me to hang out with black and Hispanic gang members and the token white people among them or whatever? No. It was the fact that every culture that is in rebellion against God is a bitch. And of the bitch cultures, there's one of them that's closest to right. That's what that is. Here's the evolutionary perspective. Yeah, she evolved that way. That's why she's cheating. That's why she rejected Jesus. No. She thinks and interprets in a way that's a fucking an abomination, and we need to work on that to correct the problems in society. Thank you. Okay, so keep in mind that you need people to tell you things this way sometimes for you to snap out of the trance. If you feel offended, okay, put in the comments. We can talk about that too. But what people are doing to try to address the problems in society, it isn't enough. And that's part of why I chose to take this very kind of controversial angle and express my moral outrage in a certain way that a lot of people might not approve of. Okay? But sometimes you got to dispense with the formalities and the lip service and get straight to the core, get straight to the heart of the matter and address the root causes, the damn underlying causes that are eating away at everything of worth in society like locusts stripping you bare.